Let's talk about the killing of Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk, for those of you who didn't know who he was a conservative far-right influencer, maybe, and the founder of Turning Point USA, a youth organization that was bankrolled by a bunch of billionaires and which gave him quite a bit of political clout in the United States. He was murdered a few days ago as he was carrying out one of his usual conservative, destroys liberal 17-year-old kid.
Welcome to the channel, guys. Looks like a lot of whiny babies have a problem with what I say, so prove me wrong.
Well, you said nothing good ever came from the Jews, but if that's true, why are bagels so yummy?
Well, you've obviously been taught by the Jews to have a problem with this school and with America, so let me ask you this. What is your definition of a woman? Next!
Another woke student totally destroyed!
Oh, jeez!
State in Georgia that approved our election, and Donald Trump said that wasn't constitutional.
All right, relax.
Donald Trump tried to undermine our
Dude,
Constitution.
You're at 10. I just walked in. I'm here to just learn.
Hey, you're an anti-patriotic, anti-constitutional person crashing our party
So let me
because
ask you one
tried
question.
to stop our democracy.
I got one question.
Donald Trump called the
Can I ask you
Secretary
one
of State of
question?
Georgia and told him to find him some votes.
What is a woman?
Oh my God.
Another woke student totally destroyed!
Maybe you should meet one.
Who wants to debate the master debater? Let's go, you right there.
That's the stupidest haircut I've ever seen.
You were wrong. You just hate America and you love abortions.
I have my arguments down rock solid. These young college girls are totally unprepared, so I can just destroy them and also edit out all the ones that actually argue back well. It just feels so good.
He was part of this debate bros, this bunch of unfuckable hate mongers that go to colleges and try to own 17-year-old kids, and who have been, I think, extremely damaging to debate. Because they have transformed political discussions not into a search for truth, but instead into just an opportunity to own your opponents. They have transformed politics into a spectator sport in which you just go see if your side wins. That doesn't mean that there wasn't any bravery in what he did. As a person who has sometimes faced opposition in person, not just online, it is challenging to be in environments where people do not want you. And the dude did have the testicular fortitude to go and show up and engage in this sort of, even though I think it's idiotic, he did have, I think, the courage to do that. Nevertheless, I don't think he was a good person. I have heard a lot of defenses of him, calling him first and foremost a father and a husband and all of that, but a lot of people who die are fathers and husbands. Reproduction is not in and of itself kind of a testament as to whether or not you're a good person. Cockroaches reproduce, bacteria reproduce, amoebas reproduce. So the fact that an individual has managed to have kids does not mean that they're a good person. Now, he might have been a good father, don't get me wrong. There doesn't seem to be any indication that he did not love deeply his wife and his children, and I am sure that his family misses him deeply, and I feel sincerely sorry for his kids in particular, and as well as for his wife and his parents, because it is not easy to lose somebody that you love. Having said that, the fact that somebody is good or nice in their private life says nothing about who they are in public, particularly in those spaces where they have an influence. I think that for that, we need to look at what he did, and what he did was to push forward an ideology that I consider to be extremely damaging and dangerous, and that is Christian nationalist ideology, an extremely far-right capitalist view of the world and the economics, and also an occasionally racist and homophobic view of the world.
Because we've all been in the back of a plane when the turbulence hits, or when you're flying through a storm and you're like, I'm so glad I saw the guy with the right stuff and the square jaw get into the cockpit before we took off, and I feel better now thinking about that.
No, I mean, like, you want to go thought crime? Like, I'm sorry, if I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified. Just customer service, at times, you can't, here's what's upsetting to me, Heather, is if I'm dealing with somebody in customer service who's a moronic black woman, I wonder, is she there because of her excellence, or is she there because of affirmative action? It almost creates thought patterns that are not necessarily wholesome. It creates resentment, doesn't it, Heather? This is not a way to design society.
I've shared prayers on here before and said, God bless. And that's because my faith is really important to me. And it's also one reason why I love every neighbor. In Matthew 22, a religious teacher asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And Jesus says to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. There's no greater commandments than these. I believe it's mentioned 8 times, love your neighbor. So yes, everyone belongs, everyone's welcome, everyone is treated with empathy and respect. It doesn't say love every neighbor except. There are so many reasons I stand strong in love. I stand with everyone. That's who I am. And the love back and the God bless if you disagree is genuine.
Andrew?
I would just, to Jack's point, I'm dying to know, like, what do you think when Miss Rachel quotes scripture in that way?
I mean, Satan's quoted scripture plenty. But hold on. She's not totally wrong when she says, first of all, the first part is Deuteronomy 6:3-5. The second part is Leviticus 19. So you love God. So you must love his law. How do you love somebody?
Here we go, folks.
You love them by telling them the truth, not by confirming or affirming their sin. And it says, by the way, Miss Rachel, you might want to crack open that Bible of yours. In a lesser referenced part of the same part of Scripture is in Leviticus 18, is that thou shalt lay with another man shall be stoned to death. Just saying. So, Miss Rachel, you quote Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. The chapter before affirms God's perfect law when it comes to sexual matters.
That doesn't mean that every take he ever had was wrong. It doesn't mean that every view that he ever had was mistaken. But it does mean that all of his positions seems to have been underpinned by a number of philosophies that I think are horrendous. He did not believe in freedom, certainly not freedom from the state. He believed in an authoritarian government that could repress people. He waxed poetic about the possibility of public executions. So, no, he was not a good person.
It's how you should, by the way, this is my other problem with death penalty. It takes too long, too many appeals.
Expensive.
It should be public, it should be quick, it should be televised. No, I'm not kidding. By the way, I would totally tune in to see someone get their head chopped off. And you know what? I want to watch that execution. That'll make my day better. I want to see him on a public block and get him be publicly executed. And I think that would be justice. At what age should you start to see public executions?
16.
I think you could do it earlier. I think you maybe at age 12,
Whenever-
like 6th grade or so.
Let's go back to the immediate aftermath of Charlie Kirk's murder and think about how the original understanding was that he was probably killed by a left-wing person who killed him because of his views. I don't want to litigate that, but I do want to talk about some of the reactions that I saw online of people who were first celebrating his murder and second saying that freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. I want to start with that. The people who claim freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences are, as a rule, absolute imbeciles. And I don't mean that figuratively. I mean that if you say freedom of speech does not mean freedom of consequences, you are an imbecile. You are a person who probably did not get enough oxygen at birth. And the reason why I say that is because saying freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences actually says nothing about the important part. What are those consequences? Is it supposed to mean that freedom of speech doesn't mean that you don't get to get killed because somebody didn't like your speech? Because if that is the position that you have, then you need to understand that the murder of people like Martin Luther King, the people from the Charlie Hebdo magazine, the attempted assassination of Salman Rushdie, the decapitation of Samuel Paty in France, the murder of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, as well as the assassination of dissidents in China, Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and every other place are somehow justified because their freedom of speech didn't free them from the consequences of their speech. That is why I say that that take is an absolutely stupid take, and it deserves mockery whenever you see it. So please, do me a favor, if you want to honor my memory in any way, whenever somebody says freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences, call them a fucking idiot, and then prod them as to what exactly they mean. Do they mean that there are certain types of speech that justify murder? Because if they believe that it justifies murder, then they probably also believe that you should be imprisoned for your views. Now, this might be a shock for some people, but being in prison for a year is better than getting shot in the fucking neck. So, if you believe that people should be shot for their views, you should probably be okay with the idea of punishing them by sending them to prison, or silencing them, or censoring them, or having the government decide who gets to say what and what they cannot say. So, yes, it is true that speech can have consequences, but we need to be clear as to what consequences are legitimate consequences for speech. And murder, violence, is not a consequence, particularly when the speech is coming from a person with no actual political power. Although it is true that Charlie Kirk was an influential far-right conservative in the United States, the fact remains that he was not part of the government, he was not in charge of an army, he was not carrying out the genocide in Gaza, despite the fact that he supported it, he was not carrying out the brutal repression of immigrants in the United States, even though he supported it, so killing him did absolutely nothing to stop the things that somebody might dislike. So this isn't Operation Valkyrie, this is just murdering a person because you don't like the things he has to say. On the issue of celebrating Charlie Kirk's murder, I think that we need to make a distinction. There has been a sort of hagiographic analysis of Charlie Kirk, bordering on religious fanaticism that I think should be a subject for some sort of psychological study, showing Charlie Kirk standing next to Jesus and just insane takes from a bunch of people who are openly against empathy, who justify the genocide of the Palestinians. Genocidal people who somehow also believe in the magic and wizardry of a poor peasant who asks people to turn the other cheek. So, without entering into that hagiography, or even into the fake lamentations for the death of somebody that I did not think was a good person, I think it is important to still not celebrate the killing of Charlie Kirk. Not only because murder is not okay in general, not only because, unquestionably, his wife, his children, his parents are all people who are suffering enormously at the loss of somebody that they loved. And even if you didn't care about it, and even if Charlie Kirk had no children, had no family, and he was just alone, not who somehow had managed to amass a large internet following, you can still feel that his murder was wrong. Political violence like that only increases repression. So if you had thought that killing Charlie Kirk would lead to positive changes in the United States, the answer is the exact opposite. Charlie Kirk did not have control of an army, he did not run the government, and so killing him only empowers the base of the people whose views you consider to be bad and dangerous, and who, more importantly, are now going to use his death to justify more and more repression. And in fact, we can already see that. We can see that people are openly calling for basically the social death of people who have expressed joy or glee at the death of Charlie Kirk, and even calls for dismantling the opposition to the Trump administration based on their political views. So this is just what happens. There are some historical precedents for it. This is not a comparison between Charlie Kirk and the person I'm going to mention, but just to give you a parallel. When Horst Wessel, an SA member, was murdered by a Dutch communist in Germany, the Nazi Party used his death as a propaganda tool and also as a way to increase repression against opponents. So killing somebody without power only emboldens those whose views they share. And perhaps more importantly than anything else, political violence like that is bound to come back. So from that perspective, just the pragmatic understanding of the consequences of your actions, doing something like the murder of Charlie Kirk serves no useful purpose for your political side, and on the contrary, will only make things worse. But it is bad also for other reasons. At some point in your life, when you have a political ideology, you need to reach first principles. You need to reach the understanding that certain things are wrong regardless of the people to whom it happens. You cannot then justify the killing of somebody on the opposing side because of their views. Because it doesn't matter what you believe in. There are people who do think that your views are hateful, that they are aggressive, that they are violent, and that they are kind of a justification for your killing. So if you're willing to give yourself that right to use violence in order to silence others, you need to understand that that same argument will be used to repress you. And so in that never-ending escalation of violence, we will see the end of civilization and the death of society as we know it. We don't need to actually hypothesize on this point. One of the arguments that are often used against freedom of speech is the rise of the Nazis. The fact that as the Nazis were coming into power, they had very terrible views, they have a lot of propaganda, and that basically opened the door not just for the totalitarianism of the Nazis, but eventually the genocide and the Holocaust. However, that is an incorrect historical reading. In her masterful book, Hate, Why We Should Combat It with Free Speech and Not Censorship, Nadine Strossen, the former head of the ACLU in the United States, explains how the rise of the Nazis, despite popular misconceptions, was not made possible by the use of hate speech or by the use of hateful propaganda. Instead, it was made possible by the unchecked use of political violence. There were laws that prevented speech, there were laws that repressed hate speech, and yet it was violence that allowed for the chaos that eventually made it possible for the Nazis to take power. So, you need to understand that this is a Faustian bargain, which eventually will be used to justify your destruction and your repression. You need to stick to these first principles. You need to believe that freedom of speech does mean freedom of speech. It doesn't mean that there is a loophole that means that you can kill people. It doesn't mean that the state gets to, well, occasionally justify repression, as they will. Thank you for watching. Free speech, free Palestine, non-Serbia.